participação, tem até 2 alunos ali da graduação em estatística. Vamos começar mais uma vez o nosso tempo de debate. Organizamos em parceria NEPO e Programa de Pós-Graduação em Demografia. Nesta quarta temos a ilustre presença de Katherine Keenan. What do you say? So she is senior lecturer in population and health research group at the University of St. Andrews, UK. She has a bachelor in social anthropology from London School of Economics and Political Science, PhD in epidemiology and demography from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She works a lot with determinants of health in a global context, and in particular focus on emerging public health threats and multimobility and antimicrobial resistance. Okay. And she will give a talk about multimobility in a perspective of such time. So I'll give the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here, and fantastic to meet such a great and well-established group of population scholars in Brazil. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 different studies. I hope you don't mind if I do the talk in English. Okay, I'll go slowly. If there's any questions or something, please just put your hand up. I'm going to talk about multimorbidity today. I'm going to introduce 2 different studies that we've been working on in the centre. And I'm also going to then make a bigger, broader discussion about what demography and what social science can contribute to the study of multimorbidity more generally. But before that, I hope you don't mind, I'm going to wave the flag for our centre for 1 minute. So you might not know about St. Andrews because it's a very small place and it's a very small university, but we are a centre of population and health research. We are the only centre for demography in Scotland, believe it or not, and we're one of the biggest groups in the UK. And we're the Scottish arm of several large centres in the UK. So, for example, the Connecting Generations Centre, which is a really big centre which is coordinated out of Southampton, but also connected to the Oxford University Centre, the Acute Centre for Demographic Research. Which works on connections between different generations. And this is our Connecting Generations team. We're also going to host the European Population Conference next year in Edinburgh. St. Andrews is not big enough to host that place, we don't have a hotel big enough. Yeah, we're hosting it, but it will be in Edinburgh, so please come and visit us if you do want to come. And if you know any promising students, we also have 3 fully funded PhD opportunities available at the moment, open to international population students. So please, if you're in Scotland or you're in the UK, come and visit us. We'd be very happy to host you. And then, as Everton already introduced me, I don't need to talk so much about this. But just to say that I have quite an interdisciplinary background. I studied anthropology as an undergraduate and then went on to more quantitative focused work, so demography and epidemiology. But I've taken that mixed methods element into my current work. So a lot of the work that I do now is focused on interdisciplinary projects which bring together qualitative data and quantitative data. And since I moved to St. Andrews in 2017, I've been focused on 2 major health problems, multimorbidity that I'll talk about today, but the other one is antimicrobial resistance, with which I work with biologists and genomics experts and is a major global health threat. At the moment, our work is focused on East Africa, but we also do some work in the UK. And while I'm here in Brazil, I'm trying to make contact with people who are doing work on antimicrobial resistance as well. So if any of you would like to talk to me about that, I'd be very interested to talk about that as well in the break. But today I'm going to talk about multimobility. So some of you are probably very familiar with what this is, but for those of you who aren't, it's commonly defined as an individual having 2 or more diseases concurrently. And with increasing longevity, this is an increasingly prevalent issue, right? As we live longer, we suffer more diseases, and we also may survive those diseases to go on and have another disease. Obviously, the prevalence estimates of this vary a lot by how it's being measured, but recent attempts to try to aggregate or synthesize global prevalence of multimorbidity. For example, this is one heat map which has been published recently, aggregating many different studies, show clearly that it's not just a problem of the global north, right? It's not just a problem of high-income, aging countries. It is a problem, and actually Brazil has a relatively high prevalence of multimorbidity, and so do many parts of Asia. So it's a global issue. What does vary by region tends to be the types of constellations of diseases that co-occur together. So it's more common in sort of poorer or less well-resourced regions that there might be infectious diseases co-occurring with non-communicable diseases. To underline the fact that it's not just a problem of Europe or North America, this is another attempt to aggregate data across many different studies, prevalence studies. We can clearly see that South America has some of the highest rates of multimorbidity. This is considering older adult, middle-aged and older adults. And what is pretty much universal in most of these studies is that women have higher rates of multimorbidity, which is consistent with the morbidity-mortality paradox, that women have higher life expectancy but tend to have poorer health during their lifetime. And as I said, the constellations of multimorbidity can vary a lot depending on more or less the stage of the epidemiological transition. So in some areas of the world, the epidemiological transition is more protracted. There are still high rates of infectious diseases like HIV or tuberculosis, for example, whereas in other areas of the world, the constellations of diseases tend to be cancer or cardiovascular disease, for example.
Say that and interrupt.
Yeah, please interrupt, yeah.
Is there a relationship with socioeconomic development?
It's a very interesting question, actually, and it's a difficult one to estimate because understanding multimorbidity is also affected by socioeconomic development. So having better healthcare means that you detect more diseases. For example, right, diagnosis rates are higher in areas that are richer. And I don't think there's a clear relationship. It's partly complicated by the measurement issues and bias, but it's also complicated by other factors like, how some diseases are more likely in some, poorer socioeconomic areas or whatever. So it's not a straightforward yes or no. I think there is a relationship, but it has to be disentangled differently in different regions in order to understand it. It would be a very interesting case study to look at how that plays out, for example, in Latin America across many different countries. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, there's certainly within context a very strong socioeconomic gradient, so that people who are at the lower end of the income distribution have higher levels of multimorbidity. But we're going to come to that in a minute in the context of Scotland. One of the challenges of this area is how to measure multimorbidity. So it seems very simple to say, oh, well, this is 2 or more diseases. But we can pick apart this sentence very carefully. So what is a chronic disease? And does it mean that that's irreversible? Do you always have that disease, for example? What about if you survive cancer? Do you always have cancer then, for example? And what diseases count? What diseases do you have on your list? And then how and who reports those diseases and how accurate or complete is that? And that can vary a lot depending on the data source. And in the talk today, I'm going to show data which is derived from surveys and also derived from administrative data, so medical records. Both have their pros and cons in various different ways. Of course, with surveys, we're able to perhaps have a better understanding of repeat measures, we have a richer set of covariates, but we often have much smaller samples, which is difficult when you have rare diseases. We also have some bias because usually those diseases are self-reported depending on whether the person's been diagnosed or not, whether they remember, when do they remember they were diagnosed, and so on, as you can imagine. And with medical records, you might think, oh, well, it solves the problem, but you then get into other kinds of issues as well. So it depends on the type of administrative data you have. If you're using primary care data from a GP, you get a much bigger coverage. But if you're using secondary care data, which is just from hospitalizations, you tend to get the more severe end, and you also end up with issues that we've discovered in our medical records when we're using secondary care data. Somebody has a hospital record, but it looks like they developed 5 diseases on the same day. But it's because they were admitted to hospital on that day and they had an event, some kind of cardiac event, for example, and they were then, all of these 5 diseases were kind of diagnosed on the same day. But actually, of course, they maybe had diabetes for, months before that. So getting accurate dates of onset is very, very tricky. And then, of course, unless you link this medical record data to other sorts of data, the most, in terms of covariates, you'll have are age and sex, which, as demographers, we kind of a bit more, we love age and sex analyses, but we also love other kinds of data to be able to look at socioeconomic inequalities, for example. And then, so there have been also a number of studies recently looking at how to measure multimorbidity and the problems of measuring multimorbidity, and across a number of different reviews and studies, around about half of multimorbidity studies use only 8 conditions to measure multimorbidity. And the most commonly used, you can't see this, is it's a bit small, but for example, cancer, hypertension, stroke, coronary heart disease. These are commonly used conditions, but often miss out many, and also depression, as you can't really hear this, depression is also used quite often. So many of these estimates of multimorbidity are based on a really limited list of diseases. And so do we really understand the full scale of it? Probably not. There have been efforts recently to try to decide, well, what is the common list we should use of all of the diseases? And so this is the result of a consultancy kind of piece of research, which consulted with many different types of clinicians and also related it back to the global burden of disease valleys, and tried to develop a list of about 40 conditions that you could consider. But there are still issues with this and still questions, right? So, for example, depression and anxiety are included in this list. Are they considered chronic? If you have an episode of depression when in your 20s, are you then considered to always have depression? If you have cancer, if you have a skin cancer and you have an operation and you recover, are you then considered to have cancer forever? So these issues of chronicity and how we measure it are still really thorny issues in the literature, and there's no straightforward answer about that.
Because there's also changes with time.
Exactly, right. So screening, changes in screening, cancer screening, for example, might pick up higher levels of cancer in some types of cancer but not others. So there's a number of different challenges. Included on this list more recently is COVID, long COVID as well, which has become a really big issue and raises another issue of what is a chronic disease versus an infectious disease, right? That this idea of multimorbidity was predicated on the idea that these were non-communicable diseases, right? Really not related to infections at all. But we are now discovering, even though on cancers as well, that many cancers are derived from previous infections. And then taking a broad look at the literature, that up till about the last sort of 10 years or so, the multimorbidity literature was dominated by clinicians, by epidemiologists mainly. And most of the work was cross-sectional. And it really was sort of, dare I say, kind of obsessed with the idea of clustering and the idea of picking apart clusters of diseases to try to understand the etiology and the causal mechanisms behind them. And so, you get a lot of papers, for example, like this, which take huge data sets of medical records and try to implement clustering algorithms, which are very useful in themselves, but don't necessarily take a kind of population level look at the issue, and also a cross-sectional. Suppose the position I would come from my own work, is to think about multimorbidity as a process rather than a state that you're in, right? And this, I might think about this as a life course process. So it's about the process of biological aging, but it can be also considered the process of inequality, cumulative disadvantage over the life. And that's one of the approaches. Sometimes we work with things in terms of states, so transitioning from one state to another, alive to dead, or married, unmarried, divorced, or however, whichever your domain is. So we're already sort of well, established in thinking about ways of doing that. So this can be useful for thinking about transitioning between different specific disease states. For example, this is one from diabetes to having diabetes and one other disease. Okay, so we can set up these state spaces very easily. So this is where the work that I'm going to present sort of came out of. We started a project which was funded by the Academy of Medical Sciences, which was designed to establish a data source in Scotland, which was capable of analysing these things longitudinally. We also wanted to do some preliminary work looking at social inequalities. And then in parallel, there was a PhD studentship, which St Andrews has an arrangement with the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, where we share research, we share PhD students. And one of these was dedicated to looking at multimorbidity in the global context. So I'm going to present some work from those today. But first of all, we started with doing a scoping review of thinking about how can we actually estimate and model multimorbidity longitudinally. And it was done during the pandemic when we couldn't access any data, so it was a perfect task to do during the pandemic because we couldn't do any analysis. And at that time, the field has now expanded a lot more, but at that time there were around 34 papers published. And they mainly looked, you can see how the list of diseases range from 3 to 900, so it really illustrates how variable measurement is in this area. Attempts to aggregate prevalence are, very difficult and challenging. But we identified 3 main ways of, or in the literature, how people have approached modelling it. First was thinking about accumulation over a life course or over time. The second was thinking about longitudinal disease combinations, which there aren't that many approaches. And then the third one was thinking about transitions, which we just talked about, and which we already know quite a bit about in population studies. So we took one of those, and we took a couple of those, and we decided to try to apply them in the Scottish context. And the work I'm going to present next is joint work with Eloy Ridd, Genevieve Cesard, and Frank Sullivan, some of whom are now moved on to other projects. Eloy is still with us, and Frank is in the School of Medicine. And we're interested in looking at disease accumulation and sequencing in Scotland. And first of all, really to understand how they play out among those different socio-demographic and socio-economic groups. First of all, for those of you who don't know much about Scotland, which is probably was me until I moved to Scotland, I have to admit. Historically, Scotland has been dubbed the sick man of Europe. Okay, it has some of the highest rates of mortality relative to areas of England and relative to areas of Western Europe. And this is driven actually mostly by excess poor health in urban areas, particularly Glasgow. Some of you might have heard of the Glasgow effect, where Glasgow, even if you control for many other different elements, Glasgow still has poorer health than all of the areas around it. So it's something of a kind of enigma as to what exactly explains the Glasgow effect. And it's a good example for health inequalities teaching that I use quite a lot. So the excess mortality and excess morbidity in Scotland is partly driven by high rates of diabetes, by cardiovascular disease, but in more recent cohorts has been driven by chronic liver disease and substance abuse. So it's also an area which has got extremely high rates of drug deaths among working age adults, for example, in more recent years. And work shows that the gap between Scotland and the UK is widening, and that within Scotland itself, inequality gradients are steepening. And if we think about birth cohorts rather than period effects, there is evidence that people who were born in the 1950s are what they call the golden cohort. So they seem to have some kind of health advantage over other cohorts. But those born since the 1970s have much higher mortality due to these reasons that we talked about. We don't really know. It's been described. I think that they held an advantage. it's more that the other cohorts had disadvantages than they held an advantage. I think that might be fair to say. Is that post-1970s, those cohorts experienced neoliberalism, very extreme levels of neoliberalism. So Scotland was a very industrialised, manual, working class kind of driven society, a lot of shipping, a lot of shipyards. During the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher was in power, she decommissioned all of those areas, so there was a lot of deindustrialization, especially in urban areas. And that has, and more recently, that has driven things like high rates of substance abuse in more recent cohorts. There are also other theories about that, but I mean, there are other theories to do with like vitamin D. You know, people have hypothesized that because it's further north, you know, it's also associated with worse rates of cardiac
What that has to do with your body?
The 1950s, I don't know. I think the cohort before, the war cohort, suffered particularly, and so they were relatively better off compared to those who came after and came before. I don't think there's an exact explanation of their benefit or advantage. Hope that helps. Okay, so just to give you an overview of how we try to link data, we're not lucky enough to have a population register which is all nicely linked up like they do in Finland or Norway or all of these other places. So we tried to put this together based on census data. So we were able to link the cancer register, which has every single cancer diagnosis, the diabetes register, which has the same, and we also had access to hospitalization and medication data. And then we have a 5% sample of everybody who participated in censuses, which are every 10 years. And using community health index numbers, like we were able to link these across and to construct some kind of longitudinal cohort of people. And more recently, a team in Edinburgh are now using this cohort and adding on a lot of area-based measures of green space, of pollution, of social cohesion, which we're going to use to look at environmental determinants.
But you are able to identify the same person in each census?
Yeah. This is a Scottish longitudinal study. So it's linking people across censuses.
Wow.
Yeah. Only for a 5% sample, but it's random. Yeah. So
it's really exciting.
Yeah. Now actually this is possible with 100% census with the right kind of research question and the right kind of protocols. But it takes some time. That's why I'm saying it's all future. Because some of it's coming further. We had a census last year, for example. Last year, yes.
Yeah, we also kind of having census 2022 as well.
Yeah. We had an unfortunate thing with our Scottish census that actually we didn't reach the threshold. We were supposed to get 85% and we didn't get it. So we had to go back to the field and recollect the data.
85%?
Yeah, we had trouble to reach it. It was the first digital census that we did, and I think there wasn't a lot of public trust. Yeah, so that was a challenge. Now they have to create quite a lot of weights to use this data and do some post hoc analysis. But it's still possible, I think we can use it, but it's creating a bit of a slowdown.
It's impressive. We are discussing exactly at this point in Brazil today.
And what is the usual threshold you use for usability of the census?
We have losses of 8-10% estimated.
Yeah. We have the same, but in fact, it was like a little bit of a scandal because Scotland decided to delay the census by 1 year because of COVID. It should have been in 2021.
We delayed two.
By 2, right? And people are arguing that because of the question of Scottish independence, people are arguing that it was a mistake. England did it in 2021 and they got good representation and they got good participation and they said, oh, we should have done it simultaneously and it would have been better.
But where it comes the health questions, do you have that in census? Or do you link with administrative records?
Yeah, we're linking with administrative records.
Okay.
Yeah, so say for example, in this work I'm going to show, it's everybody who was present in 2001 and then all of their health data up to 2019. So you can create a kind of longitudinal picture of it.
Nice.
It took a long time to get the linkage sorted out, which is why I'm only going to present preliminary work today. It took about 2 years to get it sorted out.
Can I ask a question just out of how do you get access to that? Because me and some colleagues, we also want to do some kind of similar stuff.
Yeah.
Like identify the people and sample in each census and create kind of a panel. But you have to know privacy and those kind of things.
Yeah.
And the National Statistical Office, they are very.
They're very careful.
And yeah, they didn't give it. I mean, they do have it. They do have the record. You can identify people in different.
Well, I
How do you get that?
Well, I didn't do that. So these people set up this thing called Scottish longitudinal study, and maybe you should get in touch with those people and ask them, because it took a long time to get it set up, but now it's established and it's funded by the research agencies. And it's actually free to use it now. So all of this linkage was free. So because they want to encourage people to use it.
Yeah.
The only drawback is that you have to go physically to Edinburgh and sit down at a desk to use it.
There's a certain
Okay, right, yeah, I didn't know if you have a similar experience.
If said you need to go to Rio and there's a cabin.
Yes, you have to sit literally in a sort of little booth and use it. Yeah, it's quite strange. Yeah. Anyway, so this is what we have right now, and I'm going to show you some preliminary work based on that. So as I said, we have a 5.3% sample, it's a bit small, sorry about that. We've selected a cohort of people who are aged 30 in 2001, and we followed them until they either die or they exit the study in various different other ways. So we have birth cohorts of people who were born from 1931 to 1971. Using our health data, we've constructed a measurement of multimorbidity, which is based on this recent index that was published, so it's 43 diseases. We extracted the ICD-10 codes from that and timed them in months, so we have something about when those diseases were onset. And then from the census, we took some data, so we have gender, age, marital status, household size, and I'm going to show stuff for that, tenure, which means whether you own your house or whether you rent your house. And then there's also such a thing called the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a very aggregate measure of area level deprivation.
Sorry, can I ask something?
Yeah.
It's a global health system for
Yes. Yeah, so there is a private healthcare system, but very few people use it. And in order to use the private, you have to go through the public. So everybody is in public. Yeah. So you have good coverage, and very few people use the private one. And especially for these years, it's becoming more common now for people to use private care, but for these years, it was relatively uncommon. So
Thank you.
we feel like we have good coverage. That would be the other complication, I suppose, of Brazil, is two different systems. Right, so what did we do? First of all, we wanted to understand what is the age pattern and also what is the cohort pattern for multimorbidity, right? And so we wanted to do this longitudinally. So we fitted growth curve models where we were able to, it's a two-level hierarchical model where we're able to look at each person's trajectory over the years that they participated in the survey. And here you can see these predicted scores for multimorbidity plotted according to the birth cohort that that person was in and their age here as well. So, for example, this dark blue cohort here are the oldest. They were born in 1935 to 1931 to 1935. We follow them from age 65 until age 85-ish. And these are the youngest born cohorts who were born, sorry, it's perhaps not so easy to see, 1966, have I got that right? Yes, 66 to 71, right? So you can see that we don't have perfect data to look at age cohort patterns because we don't always have overlap, right? But we are able to look at something. And so I think what we can see clearly is that, well, the first thing is that multimorbidity rises steeply with age, as we know already. And we can also see that in the most recent born cohorts at the same ages, that multimorbidity scores are higher. So it seems as if every cohort, every younger cohort, seems to be progressively sicker, right, at the same ages. We also tested interactions between age and cohort, and there was an interaction. And so basically what that shows on this graph is that at older ages, accumulation of multimorbidity is faster. So it's a slightly steeper line in the older cohorts in the older ages, which you might expect as people get older. So So the question is, what's going on with this kind of cohort effect? And it's quite interesting. It's been found in other studies as well. It's been found in Canadian data and US data. We're also interested to think whether there might be some kind of period effect in our data. So is it really a cohort effect or is it a period effect? And there might be good reasons to suspect that there might be period effects. Over time, diagnosis might have improved. It might be a good news story that healthcare has improved. People go to the doctor more often, people get referred more often. And in 2004, specifically in Scotland, there was what's called a quality outcomes framework, which is like a policy intervention which was designed to improve referral rates. So this incentivized doctors to refer people to secondary care. So it's possible that this might have meant that there were more diagnoses. And so when we just do a crude plot of the proportion who have 2 or more diseases by year across our study here, we see that in all of these different age groups, blue is age 50, yellow is age 60, and grey is age 70, increases, although much bigger increases in the older age groups. However, there are no sharp breaks associated with period effects. It's not as if we could say that, well, in 2004 there was a huge sudden increase in diagnosis patterns or something like that. And it's challenging to disentangle cohort and period effects when you see linear trends in cohort and period, right? This is a really challenging thing. We have tried to fit models which attempt to untangle this, so-called HAPC models, which use three-level multi-level models with a random effect for periods. They take a long while to fit, and when they do fit, they don't show very strong evidence of period effects. However, I'm not going to get into the APC problem too much. There may be experts on APC here. Wrong. But there's a big debate in the literature about whether HAPC models really are actually able to disentangle period effects, actually. So anyway, putting this question to one side, we were still interested in thinking and describing the cohort effect that we saw. Another thing we were interested in understanding is, in these different cohorts, do we see different deprivation gradients? So is it that inequality is greater in younger cohorts or greater in older cohorts? And one thing we used is the so-called Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which is a very small area level index of deprivation, which takes into account 7 different domains, things like housing, healthcare, unemployment rates, things like that. And you can see, you can actually, if you I might share the slides, you can click on this link, and there's an interactive map that you can look at for Scotland. This is, for example, Glasgow. The redder areas indicate more deprived areas, and the bluer indicate less deprived areas. So you can see how variable Glasgow City is, for example. It would be very interesting to look at a map of Campinas and Sao Paulo. It depends, but you can't really read it very well. But the population size is usually under 1,000, so they're quite small area level. Yeah. Within St Andrews, for example, there would be like maybe 5 different areas.
It's smaller than municipality level.
Definitely smaller. Yeah, exactly. It's almost like a few streets. Yeah. So anyway, using this, you can then create deciles or quintiles for people who are in the lowest quintile, the highest quintile, and then look at that according to how it correlates across multimorbidity. So just using a cross-sectional perspective and looking across age groups, red being the most deprived quintile and purple being the least deprived quintile, you can see, interestingly, that like in younger ages, the expected deprivation gradient is kind of very clear. So those who are most deprived have the highest, or are more likely to have 2 or more diseases. And as you get into older ages, actually, it turns out to be the least deprived who are more likely to have 2 or more diseases. And why do we see this in a cross-sectional perspective? Those of us who are demographers will probably recognize that this is due to a survival bias, whereby those people who are in the most deprived groups are more likely to die from their conditions. have an issue too, right? Yeah, and so it's not that these people, they are more healthy, but they're also very lucky because they managed to survive at this age, right? So that explains this in cross-sectional perspective, why we see this flipping of the deprivation gradient. But if we look at it in a longitudinal perspective and using our growth curve models that we've talked about before and plot these out, on the left-hand panel you see the most deprived group, and on the right-hand panel the least deprived group. You can see clearly here that the average multimorbidity score is higher in the most deprived group and is lower in the least deprived. And the most deprived groups also, you can't visualize it that clearly here, but have slightly steeper gradients in terms of their accumulation, which is what we might expect based on health inequalities literature. We were kind of interested then, as I said, to understand whether the deprivation differential, like the health inequality differential, varied by cohort, by age. And in order to do that, we did that in quite a crude way, which we might develop later on. But so we used the predicted scores for each of the deprivation quintiles at different ages and different cohorts, and we've subtracted from the scores from the top, the most advantaged quintile, we've subtracted the least advantaged quintile scores and plotted them here. And so what can we see from this model? Well, on the y-axis here you have the differential, and so above this 0 line, it shows that these are the people who are the most deprived quintile having higher multimorbidity, and below this 0 line, this is the people who are most deprived having lower scores. So this is the flipping that we talked about. So basically, at most ages and at higher ages, the most deprived people have higher scores. Each of these lines then represents a birth cohort, and you can see that the average score for each of those birth cohorts, that is the average differential, is higher for each of those birth cohorts. And yeah, so this we think kind of represents that with increasing age, deprivation differentials widen. We could then also try to compare at the same age among different cohorts. So let's take, for example, age 50, and let's compare the differentials along this line at age 50. Then an interesting pattern emerges that those who are in slightly younger cohorts have, in younger cohorts, have higher differentials. So it does look like with every cohort that the deprivation differentials are increasing. That is, inequalities are gradually widening. I should caveat this by saying this is the first time I've presented this or talked about this. If you have any other suggestions of how to calculate this or discuss this or show it, I'm very, very happy to chat more about that. Finally, another dimension of inequality in our data is housing tenure, which is when you own your house or rent your house, which is very interesting and shows similar kinds of patterns you might expect, as you might expect, that people who own their house have better health than people who rent their house. But this is adjusted for things like education, for area level deprivation. So we see these differentials in all cohorts, and we see them emerging earlier for each successive cohort. And this, I think, sort of demonstrates that inequality is kind of multifaceted. Even if we're controlling for the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which apparently includes all of these fantastic measures in, there's still something about where we live which is kind of not covered by that measure. So there's definitely something about environmental determinants that we're not taking into account. Then you might think, okay, well, what's going on with the specific diseases in each cohort? So we looked to see what were the kind of most prevalent first diseases in all of these different cohorts. And if you like, which diseases are becoming more prevalent and more popular over in different cohorts. And so these are the oldest cohorts, and across all of them, cancer and chronic pulmonary disease are very important diseases. But you can see that in more successively or later born cohorts, diabetes is moving up the rankings, so to say, and so is liver disease, which corresponds to things you know about trends in obesity and trends in alcohol use in these different cohorts. And then correspondingly, some other diseases are like moving down the rankings, if you like. So things like congestive heart failure, as a first disease, is moving down the rankings, which I suppose is a good news story, right? If you don't want your first disease to be something as fatal as a congestive heart failure, you'd rather have something milder that's possible to treat, and you have a better survival. So in some ways, this is a story of better diagnosis trends and perhaps better health-seeking behaviour. Just a final note, we have published another study about this, which uses sequence analysis to look at how 3 specific diseases are interrelated to each other and how they form clusters. And we chose cardiovascular disease, cancer, and diabetes and tracked them over 10 years. And using sequence analysis, we were able to detect 7 kind of broad clusters of diseases, and then look at how they correlated across various different socio-demographic factors. And I don't want to go into this paper in too much detail because it's not that interesting to a population audience, but one thing I do want to say is that this third cluster, which are people who have cancer first, and then they slowly transition to multimorbidity. You can be seen here, there's a green line here. It's interesting that this group, although they do transition to multimorbidity, are more advantaged socioeconomically. They're more likely to be married, they're more likely to own their own house, they're more likely to have higher education. And I think this illustrates an important fact that we talked about earlier around measurement, is that these basically illustrate cancer survivors, and those people are naturally, not naturally, but they are advantaged in very many other ways. And so this underlines the importance of considering types of disease and progression when we're measuring multimorbidity, and particularly I think cancer is a specific kind of case that we could do better in our measurement of it. So anyway, the summary of this work is that, as I said, it seems to demonstrate that there's earlier onset of multiple diseases in younger cohorts, which we don't think are clearly attributable to period effects, or at least we're not able to detect it. The types of diseases are shifting towards metabolic diseases, or those caused by alcohol use or diet. This, of course, has implications for public health prevention. Deprivation gaps are emerging earlier, and deprivation is multifaceted. And there are many issues around measurement that I've talked about already. But in our study, for example, some of those conditions would only appear in primary care, so we're perhaps undercounting some multimobility as well. I realise that I'm running quite far over. Should I skip the next study and then just move on to the discussion? What do you like?
It's up to you.
Are you happy for me to keep talking?
I do have a question about public policy.
Yeah.
If the deprivation has so broad, I mean, you don't have an indirect effect, like you said. Sometimes you see people in low scale, they doing better in terms of multimobility. So, what's the advice about? What's the message when you think about public policy? How can we tackle multimobility? Even when you say young cohorts, they are developing more multimobility than public policy.
Yeah.
So it's like
I
was thinking about.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I'm also thinking about that. I mean, I think one interesting thing about multimobility is that it's more complex, but the interventions might be more simple. Like, right, so if we note that there are interactions between many different diseases, but they're all caused by pollution, or they're all caused by lack of green space, or they're caused by obesity, or something like that, the interventions might be more simple at the end of the day. I think one thing we're working on right now is to think about environmental factors that could be, sort of area level factors around green space, pollution, social cohesion, things like that. Because rather than think about this at an individual level, which has been the focus for decades, right?
But do you have data for environmental?
Yeah, so we're just adding it into the data set now. So there's good pollution data, there's good green space data. There's also some work going on which is really, really interesting. It's using natural language processing to look at newspaper articles in this local area and then derive measures of social cohesion from that, which would then talk about kind of how people perceive their area and all these kinds of things. I don't know what this is going to throw up. It might throw up nothing interesting, but at least it's kind of new ways of thinking about measuring environmental stuff. There's also work around households as well. So this is all done at individual level, but it doesn't really take into account the fact that someone might be a carer for somebody else, or somebody might be living in a household with other people with similar diseases, and whether they co-occur in households as well. And because it might be that, you know, a household intervention rather than an individual patient intervention would be more appropriate.
So how can you sample?
And there is, so not using this data set, but there are other data sets which have sort of household level stuff. So you're able to look at clustering in households and then look at what types of households they are. But a lot of this work is data science, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have a lot of social science theory behind it. So I suppose one thing I'm really keen on in this is to have a theoretical kind of orientation to it and thinking about what would be those clusters, why would there be a household effect, or this kind of thing. Because there's a lot of, for example, machine learning people working on this problem, because it's an interesting one, because it's a lot of data and it's a lot of complexity, and they just kind of throw machine learning stuff at it, which is totally fine. But for me, I find it a bit of a challenge. I'm always looking for the theory or the social theory behind it. Yeah.
Sorry. I don't know if I will put in the right way, but it's possible to think about special differentiation where these people came from, like in the city or in the country.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the younger cohorts could be more affected for the mobility in the country. They used to live in a worse condition, and now they're maybe this.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and you can also think about life course effects. So if somebody spent their formative years in a rural area with low levels of pollution or something like that, and they set up their health behaviours in a certain way in a certain place and then moved, right? That's another thing. So yes, definitely. And this is, I think, not that well studied. It's kind of understudied, this health effects of living. So good research topic. Yeah.
When we're talking about pollution,
Yes.
what kind of pollution?
Air pollution.
Air pollution related to car emissions, industries?
Yeah, or mixture. So it's just sort of more from monitoring stations where they would monitor many different gases. I mean, the main one is PM10 or PM2.5, which is mainly from vehicles. But they're also measuring things like NO2 and other kinds of emissions as well. This is outdoor air pollution. Indoor air pollution is not such an issue in the UK. We have a lot of open fires, but they're well ventilated. So I think that's more of an issue in developing countries than you ever know. But you're right that other forms of pollution, like water pollution, or is not that well covered by the literature so far. Pollution, for example, right? Food. Yeah, exactly. It's a big emerging area, and I think one of the other emerging parts is trying to understand exactly these life course processes, and trying to disentangle that is a challenge. But then also we're still learning about the etiology of these diseases as well, and how they relate to each other. Okay, so I didn't have that much time left, but I am going to briefly talk about another project, which is not, I must admit, not my analysis, it's my PhD student's analysis, which is why I'm not going to talk very much about it, because I'll probably say something silly. But we helped to supervise it with Max Planck. And so it's another demographic approach, and it's more to think about how can we estimate the proportion of your life expectancy that you spend in a multimorbid state. So it's using a multi-state approach, right? And we came up with this phrase, multimorbid life expectancy, right? Years spent with multimorbidity, and then we tried to disaggregate that into different types of severity. So using surveys about activities of daily living to say whether somebody had multimorbidity that was disabling or was disability-free. And we tried to take a comparative approach using global aging data, which is free to use. We used the MHAS Costa Rican survey and compared that to the HRS from the United States. challenges, a lot of challenges around using these together in a comparative way. A lot of other studies were considered and thrown out because they were not comparative enough. For example, for the multi-state, you need to have evenly spaced data collection points, and many of those didn't have it. Other studies had just 2 waves, so were equally thrown out. But these are the ones we ended up with. And yeah, we estimated multinomial logit models, adjusted them to age and gender, and then stratified them. And this uses the Markov assumption, so we don't take into account the prior state. And we then use this Markov model to estimate expectancies.
This is something tricky.
Yeah.
Multimobility is independent of the prior state.
It is dependent, yeah.
So when you use the Markovian...
It's only dependent on the prior state, I think would be fair to say. Right?
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, perhaps this isn't quite right to say. Because people could have been in multiple states previously. It's only dependent on the last state. It's not dependent on all of the previous states.
Yeah. But it's still tricky.
Yeah, it's tricky. Yeah, it's tricky. It is tricky. Yeah, so we had 5 states that people could transition between, which is also tricky. Like, we could, for example, have had one disease with disability, without disability, but we chose not to do that because we're focusing on multimorbidity. Yeah, so we have death in there as well. Some people could remain in the same state. Because we're using survey data, our diseases aren't it's not a very long list of diseases, it's only 7 diseases. But they do cover, most of the main causes of death for these populations. So, how do our countries compare for transition probabilities? Well, I'm not showing all the transitions here, just ones that I think are most interesting, or we thought were most interesting. So first of all, moving from one disease having a disability-free multimobility. I don't know if you can see it very clearly on this, the colours are a bit weird, but the dark blue is the United States. So the United States were the most likely to move into multimobility, but it was disability-free multimobility. Whereas Costa Rica and Mexico, the population there were more likely to move into disabling states than they were in the United States. And Mexicans were the most likely to transition to death. We can then also calculate the state expectancy, so the amount of years people spend in these different states. And remember, we have 4 different states we're estimating here. And what can we say? There's a lot we could say about this graph. On the top we have males, on the bottom we have females. I suppose if we take every country and every gender, and we take the 2 bottom bars, so the sort of medium blue and the very dark blue, we can see that both in men and women, that the United States seem to spend an awful lot more time in multimorbid states than there is in Costa Rica and Mexico, for example. We can also see that women spend more time in those multimorbid states. But we can also see clearly, as we did for the transition probabilities, that the majority of that time in multimorbid states in the United States is spent in disability-free, whereas in Costa Rica and Mexico, it was a bit more evenly balanced, right? So there was, for example, women in Costa Rica spend on average, maybe 9 years of their life having disability, multimorbid disability, which is really quite a long time, right, to be in that kind of state. So we also looked to see if there were kind of clear educational gradients. And to be perfectly honest, there weren't really very clear educational gradients. The clearest perhaps would be for women. It was certainly clearer for women. So here we can see that women who are post-secondary compared to women who have primary education have a much smaller amount of time spent in a disabling multimorbid state. With men, the picture really wasn't so clear. So we didn't really see very clear socioeconomic gradients as we would have expected. So briefly, the contextual differences. So although Costa Ricans spent more time in non-multimorbid states, they were also more there were a lot more time in disabling multimorbidity. Why do we see these contextual differences? Well, there's a real challenge to unpick those mechanisms. Initially, we thought, oh well, Costa Ricans have universal healthcare, Mexicans and the United States don't. Maybe we'll see some really clear differences. We didn't really see that, which is interesting. But there are also other things going on. So there might be differential screening processes in different places. There might be different processes of disease management. We also have differential selection bias into certain states. So if you have better screening, then you're more likely to have a disease picked up and be in that state. So there are real challenges to making these kinds of comparisons. And we did see some effects of higher education. For example, it seems that although higher education didn't affect the total amount of time that you're spending multimorbid, it's associated with a bigger time spent disability-free. So in this respect, being socioeconomically disadvantaged brings longer life, but you still experience multiple but not disabling diseases, which is probably to be expected. Finally, I want to wrap up by talking about complexity. So these measurement issues we talked about, I don't think are just an empirical thing. We really need to think carefully about how we commonly distinguish diseases, especially how we distinguish communicable and non-communicable diseases, chronic and lifelong versus diseases that reverse or we recover from. And one of the main problems is so these measurement issues we talked about. Healthcare system is set up to deal with diseases on an individual basis. You know, doctors are specialists in one type of disease, right? And so all of the funding goes there as well. So it's changing, but that's one challenge we have to look at. And we don't really know whether these historical structures of medicine are well equipped to deal with future challenges. How have demographers thought about multimorbidity? Well, we could go back to Omran's sort of epidemiological transition and think about how he sort of discussed and theorized that causes of death would shift from infectious diseases through to man-made diseases and then also to emerging diseases of aging. But of course, this was overly focused on causes of death, one single cause of death, right? It doesn't really talk about morbidity or what kinds of diseases you have during your lifetime. And also made very strong distinctions between communicable and non-communicable diseases, which clinicians and biologists are now discovering that there are very big relationships between infections and, say, different cancers, for example. A bigger question is like, are these kind of demographic linear frameworks even useful anymore, right? I mean, several people would argue that they really don't fit empirically, and what do we really use them for? One thing I do like about Omran's framework, which I find quite nice, is that this is his last paper that was published posthumously in 1998. I think he scribbled it on a piece of paper and then someone published it after he was dead. He said here that there would be persistent inequalities in our experiences of diseases. And I think that's an important thing because he tried to include an element of inequality, even if it was very, very badly sketched, no details at all, right? But by comparison with, for example, Vala and Mesley's health transition model, it does include something about inequality, which I find interesting.
Which also has something, the five spend actually. Omran speaks about 3 in the beginning.
Yeah.
He is to 5.
Went to 5, right? Yeah.
Yes. I like more, to be honest, more the Horiuchi framework of epidemiological transition, I would say.
Yeah.
Because he also speaks about environment effect, inequality, and these kind of things. It's much more advanced, of course.
Yeah. But it's interesting that we still use these frameworks, right? I still use them to teach. But I don't.
So do I.
Yeah, and I'm starting to rethink this slightly about whether, we should at least teach them more critically. I think. That was my thought anyway. Yeah. Anyway, so what I'm trying to suggest here is that although this field has been dominated by clinicians, it's urgently needs a kind of demographic and social science perspectives on it to kind of bring out some of this health complexity across the life course, think about this longitudinally, and also, I think, to conceptualize multimorbidity as a form of inequality across the life course. Rather than choose one framework that we all love and go for that, I think actually we can choose different frameworks according to our audience, right? So for thinking about health inequalities, syndemic frameworks might be really useful. Other clinicians or public health experts might be more interested in environmental hotspots or disease cascades. And as I talked about earlier, I was hoping and I was thinking that maybe this kind of we shouldn't get lost in this complexity and give up, right? I think that actually this complexity might breed efficiency and simplicity in terms of thinking about population health, because we will discover that the same risk factors affect many different diseases, and it will be, I think, a lot easier to persuade policymakers to make one change rather than make 5 changes. So that's my hope, that we will move towards this upstream focus. There are all my slides, so I'm very happy to take questions. And
I leave the floor. I already asked.
I have another question.
please, yeah.
I think the graphic about the differentiation between male and female for level of education
Yes.
is really interesting. And could be, I don't know, like some female disease, like have more diagnosis for these people, like endometriosis could be a more, I'm sorry, it's a difficult word. And they have better diagnosis for this type of female diseases.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, so there are also things to take into account in terms of healthcare seeking as well, between men and women, right, as well. And yeah, exactly, that's another point. So in this, there are no female-only diseases, because there are just 7 diseases. But in the other piece of analysis that I showed earlier, there were...
Because nowadays we have this discussion, and
yes.
This type of diseases are not really studied.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and that's part of the problem of understanding the scale of it, is figuring out all these biases and how they might offset each other or compound each other.
And another thing is about unobserved heterogeneity.
Yeah.
And just say Jim
Yeah.
words. I mean, he used for mortality. It's the same. I think it's the same process when you're looking at multimobility.
Yeah, and we
And
haven't.
how to control for that.
How to control for that exactly? Do you have any suggestions?
I saw it. Is Hugh Cool one of the?
Yes, Hill is. Yeah.
He's one of the guys. I mean,
Yeah.
I took a course with him, so he knows a lot about unobserved heterogeneity.
I should ask him.
You should ask him.
Yeah. It's challenging with the data we have. I think that's another part of it. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for listening. I'm sorry to keep you so late.
No.
But thank you for coming. Yeah. It was great to be able to give a presentation.
Yeah, undergrad students.
Oh, it's great to have undergraduate students.
Yeah.
Welcome. Yeah. I hope you understood everything. Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming. And as I said, maybe Everton didn't explain that I'm here for the year, I'm on sabbatical here, so I'm living in Sao Paulo.
I already did.
Oh, so you just said it already, yeah. So it's very nice to be able to come and talk in person with population scholars. So,
And I hope you come visit us.
I will, yeah. You can send me the schedule for the seminars, and maybe I'll try to make 1 or 2 others, yeah. It would be good to meet people. Yeah. Thank you very much for your welcome.
Thank you. Okay.
Great.
So thank you so much. Rogério, pode encerrar no YouTube, não. There's no questions.